The simple strategies are sure to please. With dovetails, shingle nails, straight planes and awls, plumb bob, shaving horses, gouges and saws, hammers and mallets and augers and axes, chisels, bevels, tape measures and adzes go against the grain. Some call it the hard way, but it makes us stronger.
Hello everybody, welcome back into my shop. I want to take just a second to do a sound check because if there's anything that's consistent with me, it's technology issues and usually audio issues. So if the folks in the chat room can just kind of let me know how we doing on sound here. All of my levels look good on this end, but help me out if you will before we go through an entire episode and realize that the sound was crap and I've got to like post mix it later and it just sounds even worse when I do that. So let me give me a couple minutes here to get a few things set up and let me know how the sound is, please. I'm actually we are under a tornado watch right now. Severe thunderstorms have been threatening all day. So again, with my luck, the power will go out. And just across the street, a tree removal company just showed up with a stump grinder. So if there's a whole lot of background noise, yeah, that's what's going on there. Cool. Sounds like we're all good to go here. I've had a couple of these just go absolutely terrible sound-wise. Then you crank up the lav mic and suddenly everything's clipping and I got all this distortion. It's just nasty. So yeah, one of these days there will be settings and they'll be the same, but just when I think I've got the settings right, something goes wonky on the YouTube end and it seems like it's all changed. So anyway, hi, welcome back. I know it's been a while. Things have just been nuts with me trying to get on these live sessions, but since the lumberyard is actually closed for Good Friday, I got the whole day here. So I'm gonna share it with you, yay. We're gonna talk about dovetails, sliding dovetails today. I am not really going to go into tapered sliding dovetails. I've done a lot of both, and certainly tapered sliding dovetails are a heck of a lot easier to fit, but when you're cutting them by hand, they can be really fiddly. This is one of those things where if you have a router table and it's real easy to just bump the fence a little bit and create that taper and use that same fence setting not only to create the pin, but to also create the tail, things become a lot easier. By hand, we're going to use the exact same method you're going to see today for making an untapered version, but it's a little bit more fiddly to get both the pin and the tail to line up. And what I find is it's so much more straightforward to make untapered sliding dovetails by hand, and you can kind of compromise. And when you're cutting the tail, you can slightly taper the tail. You've got a consistent width pin with a slight taper of the tail. So it's a little bit looser at the back or in the middle. And if you think about it, that's what we want to do. Because most of the time when we're doing case-sized tapered dovetails, it's because we end up with a cross-grain situation. In this particular case, my grain is running vertically. My dust frame is going to come in like this. And now I've got the long grain of this style in a cross-grain situation with the case. Well, I'll end up not gluing this dovetail. Well, that's not true. I will glue the dovetail right at the front, like the visible chestnut part here, right at the front so that I get a really good fit there. And I'll leave the rest of it dry so that the case side can expand and contract and slide up and down the dovetail. So if it's actually a little bit loose is not the right word. Sure, loose, but not like jiggling about loose, just a little bit loose. At the back, that's fine. It's not going to affect anything, especially because you've got it glued at the front, so you're not getting the flushness of the drawer blade dust frame at the front and the front of the case. That's going to stay flush because it's glued, and the expansion and contraction is happening out the back, and that little bit of extra wiggle room can actually be really nice. So That being said, because if there's questions that come up on tapered dovetails, I'll try to address those at the end, but hopefully once you see this process, you'll see just kind of not how easy it is, but how it would be slightly adapted to create the taper and things. So that being said, I'm going to start by cutting the pin. And as always, please feel free to ask questions. Let me get that little lower third off. Chat room I've got open. It's all the way across the room. My vision's pretty good, but do me a favor, if you do have questions, put them in all caps. I don't think you're shouting at me. It just makes it a heck of a lot easier to kind of stand out from the rest of the chatter in the chat room. Yeah, so first thing I'm going to do, I've got several pins already cut here on this particular case side. And if you didn't catch it before, this is American chestnut. This is the first time I've had to work with American chestnut. Love it. Looks a lot like oak. It's a little bit softer than oak. It's definitely a little bit finer grain than oak. So it works a lot easier without quite so much splintering and stuff. I'm really loving it. It's a shame that the species is nearly extinct. But you can still find some plantation varieties and things like that. And every now and then a lumberyard will come into a chestnut that, you know, is storm damage or something like that. So we're all familiar with dovetails, right? You know, you've got, here is a sliding dovetail pin that is already cut. And in this case, it's actually 15 inches across. So sliding dovetails are less dovetail and more dado. But we've got that mechanical advantage in here with that dado angle. So the dovetail angle. So the first thing you have to decide is what angle do you want to use? And I long ago decided upon a 12-degree angle. So long ago that I couldn't tell you why I decided upon a 12-degree angle. It's a nice enough splay that it looks pretty, but the reason I decided on it is I ended up making jigs for it. And the first thing you're going to see me use today is this sliding dovetail fence, and it has a 12-degree bevel cut on one side. I have another one that I've had for maybe 9 or 10 years that I've been using, and actually at the bottom it says 12-degree sliding dovetail fence. But obviously this is a little bit shorter. I use this for obviously much shorter sliding dovetails. I more recently made this fence because it's 24 inches long enough to do full case sides, and I got a little fancy on it as well, where this 12-degree beveled face actually has some ultra high molecular weight tape on it, so it's nice and slippery on this face. I put some on the other face as well, and this is 90 degrees. From this bottom face to here is 90 degrees. On the underside is double stick tape, but it's well used double stick tape. In other words, when I put it on the bottom, I stuck it down on my workbench and then unstuck it and stuck it and unstuck it a couple times. So it's less about being sticky and more about just a little bit of grip. I use some of that rug anti-slip tape, and it's got just a little bit of give to it, a little bit of a spongy nature to it. So when I clamp it down, it wasn't really referencing soundly. And as I pushed a saw up against it, there was just ever so little bit of give that could change that angle. I could use sandpaper, but I actually find that sandpaper ends up being slipperier than not. If you use a really coarse sandpaper, then you're actually getting grit into the surface. And for a hand tool shop like mine, that's going to come back and hand plane the surface, I really don't want sandpaper grit on here. That's going to tear up my blades on my hand planes. So I try to avoid using sandpaper as an anti-skid surface. So just double stick tape is all I needed here. The layout of these is done just like a dado. I set a gauge to my depth, and I marked both ends of this. I wanted to determine the width of the neck. Again, that's the narrowest part of that dovetail. In this case, I set it at 3/8 of an inch. It's just kind of an arbitrary thickness or width that I know that when I add the 12-degree angle on either side of it, I am not, the widest part of the tail at the bottom, the widest part of the pin at the bottom does not exceed a 3/4 inch thick board. It's actually right about 5/8 of an inch. So if you're using 3/4 inch thick material, starting with a 3/8 inch wide neck, adding 12 degrees on either side will still keep you inside the thickness of that 3/4 inch board. So there's the other decision you have to make is if you know you're going to have 12 degrees, you may have to do a few test layouts to figure out how do I fit these angles, the shape of this dovetail into the existing thickness of my parts. So I always lay out on a center line. In this particular case, I assembled my case, and I subdivided it into fifths using my dividers. And the dividers actually mark the center point of the tail. So from that center point, I can then step out what's half of 3/8? 3/16? 5/16, right? No, 3/16, whatever. Step it out to the other side to create that 3/8 inch thickness. But for this case, because I've got to cut 4 of these on either side, I actually created a little template that really added a fair amount of consistency to this project. And this little dovetail in this face, this allowed me to kind of work out some of the spacing and everything and make sure that I knew that it was all going to work with my thicknesses. So here I've just got a scrap board. This is the shape of the tail, also the shape of the pin, depending on how you look at it. And then there's just 2 boards up here to act as fences. The distance between these 2 boards is equal to the thickness of my tail boards. So the first thing I can do is use this as a fence. Again, these 2 boards, pop it up on the fence, and it specifically positions not only the depth of the tail, but I have a center line marked right here, and that center line that I made with my dividers, I can now line that up, and I just pencil in the shape of the dovetail. Well, I knifed it in. Then, with that shape knifed in, then it was a matter of just squaring my lines across the board. Here's the important part. You want good deep lines here because then I come back with the chisel and I make that kind of first class saw cut or knife wall, whatever you want to call it. And that knife wall is where we're picking up this process right now. And it's really important because I can take my saw and it now registers cleanly in that little knife wall that I just made. It just kind of drops right in there. So then I bring my 12-degree fence up, set it down, and bam, the fence is now in place. This is the exact same process. If you've seen my videos, my later videos on the stair saw, that's the exact same process that I use to line up a fence to run the stair saw against. Now I just grab, well actually, I think I'm going to use, here's the nice thing again about that carpet tape on the bottom is, you know, pressing down, it's actually adhered to the surface kind of nicely. Just in case though, let's just do it again. Just in case it's shifted around on me. I'll get to the saw in just a second. Every time I do one of these, I get more questions about what tool did you use than the technique. These Veritas holdfasts, these things are fantastic for situations like this. A regular strike it to set it holdfast, when you actually strike it, there's every chance that it might shift the fence a little bit. Because I can just twist it and put consistent pressure down, it holds that fence exactly where I want it to be. I can use that holdfast to hold things in place. And just to be certain, I'll come back and put a clamp on the far end here. Clamp the other side of my fence down to my bench. I think I'm going to put another holdfast down here just for fun, just to be certain we're holding that board firmly. So now I'm set up to saw. And the saw I'm using here is actually a miter box saw. Well, it's a bad axe saw. I have a vintage miter box with like a 36-inch saw on it, and I've thought about using that. But the longer the saw, obviously, the more teeth, more importantly, the more gullets I have to excavate the sawdust. I could use a narrower saw. The one thing I'll say about this fence, and I may alter it in the future, but I specifically used a piece of 8/4 hardwood here because I wanted a wider reference surface to run the saw against. But the problem with the taller fence is oftentimes the handle, specifically this low part of the handle, bumps into it. So as I'm taking saw strokes, as I get to right about there, the handle starts to make contact with the fence and it will lift it out of the cut. It's not the end of the world. I do like the wider reference surface, but if I were to drop this down like another 1/2 inch, I would have clearance to run all the way across. So if you look at this, you'll see it actually tapers down. I took a draw knife just the other day because I got so sick of it bottoming out over here. I tapered the ends down and I got another like 5 inches of travel on the saw just by tapering it. So it is a balancing act a little bit, but if you're going to make one of these, 3/4 of an inch thick really doesn't give you very much reference surface, but 1 to 1.5 inches thick would give you a really good reference surface there. So I like using the longer saw just because I'm now sawing with the tooth line, parallel to the work surface. So I've got to carry all the sawdust out. And because I've just got more teeth and more gullets, I can excavate more sawdust. A shorter saw is going to cut a lot slower because if I were to use like a 14-inch saw, I can't take a pass all the way across the board without the teeth dumping any sawdust. So when I'm right here in the board, all the teeth are embedded in the board. And I've got to come all the way out to here before these little bit of teeth start moving some of that sawdust out, and come all the way to here to really clean it up. But you'll end up with several gullets filling with sawdust and never emptying. And the saw essentially stops cutting and it becomes a really slow process. And if you get too much sawdust in there, sometimes it can actually cause the saw to bind and deflect the saw off the cut. So if you're doing these cuts and you find, why are my cuts not coming out straight? It's because you're not moving the saw through the full stroke in order to excavate that sawdust. So this is pretty simple. So, the point I'm making here is you don't have to use a 24-inch long saw. I happen to have one and I'm very happy to have one, so I'm gonna use it. Oh, the other thing, this blue tape on here is my, I don't want to call it depth stop, it's my depth suggestion. This is the measurement of that angle, that slope. The pins are about 3/8 of an inch deep at the floor, but obviously the wall of this is not vertical. It's not 3/8. It's actually at an angle. So that line is a little bit longer than 3/8. I set this to 3/8 of an inch. That way I made sure that I was shallow of the bottom of the cut. So what I really just look for is when the blue tape meets the board that I'm sawing. So I line everything up and just with my offhand, press it right against the wood. And I'll start with maybe some shorter strokes right now, just to get that kerf established. Now that's got the kerf established all the way across. So now what I'm going to do is really focus on moving that sawdust. Taking the saw all the way back so that it's dumping all the sawdust in those gullets. Now, back here, let me move my camera just real quick. Back by the handle, and I should say this side of the case is the back of the case. There's going to be a rabbet here. So I actually don't really care too much about what the back of this dado or dovetail looks like because I'm just going to cut it away. It's one of the reasons I try to saw this way as much as possible because you'll always get a little bit of blowout on the back of the cut. This edge is the show face. And if you look down here, my tape is just starting to make contact back here. And results may vary from one sawyer to another, but I just find that I'm going to saw a little bit deeper on the side nearest to me than the side furthest away from me. And a lot of that may be that sawdust movement that we're talking about. So what I've found that I have to do is kind of now almost lift up the handle and just focus my strokes from kind of the midpoint back. But at this point, the kerf is well established. So it's kind of, I don't have to really focus too much on pressing it against the fence. It's just kind of running on autopilot. So now I'm hitting my tape down there, but you can see the saw's rocking a little. So I've got a high spot in the middle. And when I feel like I'm there, I'll really take a couple of backstrokes just to clear the dust out of there, and then drop the saw in. And if you just press on the spine, you can feel if there's any rock. And this is registered very cleanly. And if I look at my tape, I can see I'm at the tape all the way along the line. So I've now sawn to, I'm done. That's my final depth. And you may have noticed that in order to keep this session moving along, I have actually already sawn the other side. Now, you see this? You know, this carpet tape is probably 3 months old, but it still holds. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to free it up, but a lot of this carpet tape is pressure sensitive. So just putting that holdfast down on top of it, it really holds it firmly, and I just don't have to worry about it shifting while I'm sawing. So imagine just repeating that on the other side, and the fence just flips around and goes to the other side. The issue here is when I saw this side of the cut, I actually have to switch to my right hand. I could cross over to the other side of the bench and saw left hand on the other side, but you know, I've worked on trying to be pretty ambidextrous with my sawing, but also when you're working with a fence, it's really not that hard to switch to your offhand because you're pressing the fence up against the saw plate. You may find that it stutters a little bit because this is just kind of your dumb hand, but it's a good exercise to build some ambidexterity in there. Now, the next thing I want to do is get that waste out of there. And I could just start chopping, but because the dovetail is narrower at the top than it is at the bottom, if I start chopping, it's going to immediately jam in the opening. And this top, this neck, is an acute angle, and it can be quite fragile. It'll be really easy to kind of blow out some of the grain there. So I like to drop another kerf right down the middle. And this kerf cut actually has a name. It's called a Morton cut. Relief cut, whatever, but the official term, if you go back and look in some old woodworking text, it's called a Morton cut. I actually first heard the term from Roy Underhill on a Woodwright Shop show a long time ago, and it forced me to kind of dig around a little bit and see if I could find some historical reference for it. I could use the same big saw, but frankly, I'm just going to switch to one that is a little bit coarser. I also could take my fence, flip it around to the 90-degree side, set it up, and saw this kerf. But the position of this kerf doesn't really matter. So I just eyeball it. Start on the far side. I've got the handle lifted up, and I'm kind of moving these fingers back, almost like training wheels on a kid's bike. Just holding that saw in between my two kerfs. Get about to the halfway point, I'm going to really try to drop the saw down and extend the kerf all the way to the far side. So now I've got a visual cue, and now I can come and start the kerf on the near side and work it towards the far side. And again, this is my show face. This is the front of the case. This is the part that I really want to pay attention to, that I don't oversaw here. And frankly, I won't try to sink this saw kerf all the way to the bottom. I really am only going to go about half the depth. Because this serves another purpose. Again, finish with that full stroke to get all that sawdust out of there, just to get it out of the way. This Morton cut not only helps free the waste, but it serves another purpose as a depth stop. And now, as I chisel out the material, you can see what I'm talking about. Because what I don't want to do is screw this up and chisel too deep and remove too much material. And now suddenly, I've either blown my show face, or I've got a sliding dovetail that's going to be not fit as well because it's too deep. Where's my mallet? David has a question. Would you recommend switching from a back saw to a fine-tooth handsaw to get the length? I've actually done that, and I would say it doesn't have to be that fine-toothed. Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, this is a crosscut, so your average crosscut 26-inch handsaw is going to be about 8 points per inch. That will do just fine. That will leave a decent joint over surface. It's just going to cut really fast. So be very careful that you don't blow past your lines. If you have a panel saw, and I do mean panel saw, like a 22, 24-inch panel saw or 2-box saw, that would work pretty well for you. And I don't think there would be any issue with doing that. A back saw is going to give you a little bit more stiffness just because there's a spine there. So if you're at all concerned about it, but really that fence adds so much. And I think the length of the saw would probably be more important when it comes to efficiency of the cut. Again, it's not necessary. You could do this with a 12-inch long saw, with an 8-inch long saw. It's just going to go slower. This went pretty fast, as you saw, because I've got so many teeth to do that. From an efficiency perspective, the longer the saw, the better. That fence adds so much there. So I don't think I would have any problems with that at all. Let me just put this guy back. Put my official Matt Cremona Holdfast condom on. I'm just going to be chiseling right into this, and I want a little bit more support than these passive holdfasts here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any other questions. Again, thank you, Dave, for putting that in all caps. I would have never seen it otherwise. Thank you, Jaden. I appreciate that. I am very proud of me for losing the weight, too. It only took 2.5 years. The secret to losing weight is no secret. It's called diet and exercise, and a lot of it. A lot of exercise. I owe much of it to the recent stuff, to my Peloton bicycle, but honestly, that alone wouldn't have done it. There's a lot of other things, from yoga to weightlifting to actually getting a nutritionist on my side. But, the nutritionist part really wasn't that important. It was more of me wanting to increase my performance on the bike. If anybody doesn't know, I used to be a pretty avid bike racer and really got into it. So when I got back into spinning on my Peloton, it was kind of like coming home, and I got very competitive again. So I started seeing a nutritionist mainly for sports nutrition more than trying to lose weight, fueling and stuff like that. So now, let's go back to woodworking a little bit. I will start bevel up, because I can, out here near the end. And I'm going to try to chisel as close to the bottom as I can. Now you can see that little curve, just how easily that stuff comes out. If you have the time, and if you have a shorter dovetail that you're trying to cut, I will often sink several Morton cuts in here because it makes it super easy to pull the material out. But see if I can get a little better angle on this so you guys can see what I'm talking about with the depth stop. Nope. Got to move over. Pardon me for getting everyone sick. Hey, look, there's my plane shelf. What I should do is switch to the other camera angle while I do this so people don't get sick. Okay, there we go. So you can see a little better now. This kerf back here that I've cut, right here, I can just see the hint of this Morton cut. Back here, the Morton cut is gone. So when that central Morton cut kerf goes away, that is a big red flag to stop chiseling. Because I specifically did not saw. Remember I said I didn't saw all the way to the bottom? I saw it only about halfway there. This specifically tells me there is still meat left here that I can remove with a finer tool like a router plane in just a minute. So again, it's a gut check to really keep you from screwing this up. Now, once I've gotten about this far in, this is actually a perfect opportunity for something like a crank-necked chisel. And it's one of the reasons that I have a 1/2-inch crank-neck chisel is for sliding dovetails. However, this particular case, the dust shelves that I'm fitting here are specifically thinner. They're 5/8 of an inch. So I had to go a little bit thinner on the neck, and this will fit, but it's going to start binding very quickly. It's now telling me that I need to buy a 1/4 inch or slightly smaller crank neck chisel. I don't need one, but I now have a reason to get one, so I should have one, right? Instead, I'm just going to go bevel down. And if you keep your palm anchored on the wood like you were carving, you actually have pretty good control. And the beauty of working bevel down is with the bevel down, the wedging action of the chisel is actually up and out of the cut. So as you keep chopping, you can see how the chisel is just riding its way up and out. I could increase my angle and keep it in the cut longer like that, but because it naturally wants to ride its way out, it's kind of a nice safety measure to keep you from going too deep. But again, I'm watching that Morton cut kerf and just working that away. And I would continue to chop like this all the way across the board. Again, because I'm working from the show face back, as I get to the end of the cut, I don't have to worry too much back here about blowing things out, because here, right here, is the line for my rabbit. And you actually may be able to see some X's that I put in here marking that rabbit. So I've actually got quite a bit of room to play with, and the floor of the rabbit runs below the dovetail as well, so it would all be encapsulated in there. But one thing you'll do is just turn around and work from the other side and work in so you don't blow things out too horribly. But again, this is a good reason to have this rabbit in the back. It kind of cleans everything up. But for the sake of time, I already happen to have one of these chiseled all the way across, and I'm ready to route it out. So hand tools are all about coarse, medium, and fine. Using the appropriate tooling to make you work, not make you, that sounds awful, to allow you to work efficiently. So I could continue doing this with a chisel, and I could refine the floor of that with a chisel, and I would end up with a very nice joint. But the level of difficulty starts to climb up there, because the chisel, again, it's the most flexible, most powerful tool in your shop, but it is entirely free-handed. So getting that consistently flat floor, that's what the router plane is designed for. That's really, it's jam, if you will. As the kids say, it's jam. So I am going to switch over to the router plane, but if I only chiseled like a 1/16 of an inch off the board, yes, there would be enough there to keep the router plane laterally in the dado, in the dovetail. See, I keep calling them dados because it's basically a dado with angled walls. but I would have to work a lot more. I'd have to spend a lot more time with the router plane. The router plane is a fine tool. It is not meant for heavy removal. It can do heavy removal, but usually you end up with kind of a crappy quality of cut when you try to make it do too much, because this blade is just hanging out here totally unsupported, and it will tear out the board pretty badly. So what I will do, I'm just kind of setting it to its height here. Come on, dog, there it is. See, I've got a dog on my bench right behind this, so I've got full support. No, you can't see that. Yes, I'm aware that the audio is left channel only. It switches over to stereo once the recording goes live. But for all intents and purposes, I could run a second channel in here, but then we would get all kinds of extra mix-up. So sorry, yes, it's left channel only while it's live. It'll be stereo when it goes from live to archived. So here's the thing. Using a router plane should not be a grunt and really push through it. It is a light tool. And long, long ago, I took a permanent marker and I put a little mark on the adjustment wheel on my Veritas plane here to give me a frame of reference. And I will make 180-degree turn, and I'm still getting a light cut. The key with this pin is to really get into the corner. So I will angle the edge of the blade and get into that corner. Because where sliding dovetails go wrong is the tiniest little bit of gunk can really exponentially increase the resistance as you're trying to fit the tail later. But you can see, this is an easy cut. I'm not trying to make this thing do too much. Now it helps that the blade has been freshly sharpened, and sharp fixes everything, right? But if I try to crank down on this, I could probably take a slightly heavier cut than I am right now. But this tool is just really not designed to do that. But you can imagine if I didn't remove what I did with the chisel, just how many more passes I would have to take with the router plane. And that's when hand tool work becomes really inefficient. And you really slow things down because you're trying to do too much work with a fine tool when you could have done more with a coarser tool. I do have a depth stop set on this. See, I did it a full rotation that time. This is what 360-degree turn on the router plane is like. It's still cutting, but you can see it's a coarser cut, and it requires this kind of back and forth thing. It's not sliding across the wood like it was before. Frankly, I think that's just a bit too heavy for this. Come back towards me just a second here. This is a 1/4-inch cutter. Cutter size doesn't matter. The cutter size is just enough that it fits in between the neck of the dovetail. Usually I keep a 1/2-inch cutter in here because that's what's used for most work, but I had to switch down to a narrower tool just so that it would fit into the gap here. And there's something to be said about something a little bit narrower because I can turn it like this and work up underneath. Another thing is I just put a little bit of wax on the sole here just to give me, yeah, see I'm at my depth stop right there. It just hit bottom. The wax just makes it run a little bit smoother, but it also doesn't mar this surface. And even though this is an inside surface, I don't want to have to do a whole bunch of cleanup if I've scratched it up too much. Which ideally, if you have kept your plane well maintained, that shouldn't be a problem. I've got a little bit of junk right in the inside corner here that I think it's just easier to pull it out with a chisel at this point. This rift section of the board, this is the hard part of the oak. It's kind of the oak. See, even I'm calling it oak, the chestnut. It's the ornery part. And the router plane wanted to skip over it a little bit. Left me a little bit of a rougher surface here. There we go. Right at the mouth opening, there's a little bit of stuff in the inside corner. I think I missed with a router plane. Now it's trying to take too heavy of a cut right there. There we go. And I'm being kind of particularly OCD about this, because if there's just a little bit in that inside corner, it's going to affect the fit. It's going to cause some additional friction and bind the tail as it goes through. Okay. That's done. We done have a dovetail pin. No, Josh, I'm not worried about blowout going to the other end. Maybe you missed that earlier, but this is the back of the case. There is a rabbet here. So no, any blowout that I get there is going to be removed when I plow the rabbet later. But again, if that's something you're worried about, flip around and come from the other side. Like with most joinery like this, you will find instances where you're going to work in towards the middle. In this case, I specifically planned it to work towards the rabbet in the back so that I don't have to deal with that. Let me make a little bit of space here because we're going to move on to tails now. Am I worried about blowout? I don't worry about blowout. That's called woodworking hubris. Blowout. So cutting the tails, I think what we just did was the easy part. It's a dado. How hard is a dado, right? You know? Dovetail, though, does produce, kind of like cutting a mortise, does produce all kinds of big chunky chips that will scratch up the outside of your case and cause all kinds of problems later. So I do take some time to sweep all that junk off into the trash can. Okay, maybe it's a little bit of OCD, but just makes things a little bit cleaner for later on. So now, because we're doing a demo here, it's going to be a little bit different than if I'm actually fit into the case. when I've got an actual case that I'm working on, I prefer to actually get all the pins cut and kind of work on fitting the tails both sides at the same time. It's a personal preference of mine. I just find that if I can get one side fit and then I'm working the other side, it's easier to try to work the whole thing in at one time. Moreover, the location of the shoulders of the tails is incredibly important. That shoulder to shoulder dimension on this dust frame absolutely must match the inside to inside dimension of the case. So you need to have your case already done. You need to be able to dry fit it together and capture those dimensions. And I did all that ahead of time here. I actually did that back when I created these frames. These are all mortise and tenon and bridled together. I specifically built these frames so that they would be, all told, about 1/8 of an inch too wide. So then I was able to go to my shooting board, shoot one nice clean edge, and then take it over to the case, show it to the case, and put it in there from floor of the dovetail pin to floor of the dovetail pin, mark it, go back to the shooting board, and shoot it precisely down so that there's a nice friction fit. You can kind of turn it on its corner so that the corners fit into that dovetail pin, and you can get the exact fit. Because with a case like this, and one of the other reasons we're using a sliding dovetail is the mechanical advantage of the dovetail will prevent those case walls from bowing out over time, which can cause the drawers to jam. But if you go too narrow, it's going to cause them to curve in like that. And that can be just as much of a problem with jamming those drawers. So this is a really precise fit. Once I've got the overall side-to-side dimension of this dust frame, like I have here, so that it's going to fit exactly in those dovetail pins, then on the case, the dovetail, the pin that we just cut, I'll just take a marking gauge, come in, drop it right in there, set it so that the blade is actually bottoming out in the pin. And I now can come over to my tailboard here and mark the shoulders for the tails, which I've actually already done that, and I darkened it in with a little bit of pencil. So that leaves us ready to cut tails. And I'm going to show a couple of methods to do this, mainly because if I just showed my favorite method, everyone would yell at me. Well, I could do that too if I had those tools. Because I have a sliding dovetail plane, and I'm going to use it because I love it. But you also could just use a chisel. Here's the thing. The shoulder is the reference surface on this piece. It is the most important part to get, because when the tails come up tight, unless you want to see gaps on the inside of the case, you really want that shoulder to shoulder dimension to be good. Moreover, if you make that too narrow, again, the case is going to bow in. If you make it too wide, the case is going to bow out. All kinds of problems ensue. And there's much wailing and pulling of hair and all that stuff. Question, should the dovetail groove always be cross grain, or is a long grain groove okay too? Of course, perfectly fine. Although I would question, is that really necessary? Because if both your tail and your pin are long grain, the grain movement is in harmony, right? So you can glue the whole thing together. You could just use a regular old dado there, a dado and a groove, and get a super rock solid joint because it's long grain to long grain. If we can glue up panels just with a butt joint and have them be strong for centuries, imagine now a groove that has a glue surface on 3 sides binding that thing together, because you don't have to worry about expansion and contraction because both are long grain. That's going to be a heck of a lot easier. Now there may be a reason, say the tail is cross grain and the groove is long grain, then yes, you've got a cross grain situation. And the reason we use the dovetail is the mechanical advantage of the dovetail holds it into the case while still allowing the expansion and contraction to happen by leaving the joint dry or partially dry, maybe gluing only the front quarter or front third of it. So the orientation in this case doesn't really matter, which is one of the reasons that a sliding dovetail is not really a dovetail. It's more of a housed joint. It's a groove or a dado type joint. So if you look, this side has already been cut. So that's what we're going for. This is the tail on the side of the case, and it runs from end to end. So I've got to get that shoulder, nail that shoulder dead on. Is there an easy way to identify wood species? Wow. I mean, if you have some idea, you want to have some idea where it came from, like regionally, that'll get you started. You know, if you have no idea where in the world it came from, you have a lot more things to deal with. But if you have an idea, you know, it came locally in North America, that certainly helps out a lot. And then I would go to a place like, you know, wooddatabase.com and start looking at color match, try to get in the same color realm. Then you really want to look at end grain. You want a good, planed, cleaned wood grain surface so you could look at the pore structure. And places like Wood Database will have 10 times images of the pore structure, pore size, pore organization, how it's put together. Is it ring porous, diffuse porous, semi-ring porous, etc. will really help you narrow it down. Or just go onto a woodworking forum and say, does anybody know what this is? And that may get you a heck of a lot closer, a lot faster. Narrow it down to 3 species, then go to the Wood Database and go from there. So, got distracted there. I need to focus on that shoulder, and that means that I really need to make a saw cut here. In my particular case, I've got a cross grain joint, cross grain section here and a cross grain section here and long grain here. So I'm cutting across the grain. I need to make sure that shoulder is clean or it's going to tear all up. Now I've used a knife to mark it. That's a good start, but just a knife is not going to really help me here. And if I'm chiseling this out, what I really want to do is sever the fibers all the way down to the shape of my dovetail, which I should say I used my template, same template, just oriented it differently. Would help do it the right way. So now the template just comes in, and again, you saw that I put these fences to match the thickness of my board here, and it needs to line up with my knife line that I put on there, and I could just trace that in. And I specifically use a pencil here because these lines, this is a suggestion. I don't want to use a knife and try to work right down to those knife lines, because what will happen is you will get a loose joint. You want this pencil line to be a warning. Stop. Don't do any more until you try to fit the case. And then you take another pass, take another chisel pair, plane pass, whatever, go back and try to fit it to the case. And keep going back and forth until you get just the right fit you want. Do not remove these pencil lines because there's every likelihood that you're going to end up with a loose joint. Mauricio says, could you not glue it? I don't have any context for that question, Mauricio. Could I not glue what? Could I glue a duck to a goose? I could. Well, would I want to? I'm going to make some chisel cuts here. Knife wall, first class saw cut, whatever. If this entire edge were cross grain, say this was a solid board here. Oh, sorry. If I was laying in a solid panel, this entire long edge would be cross grain, and I would want to come back and most definitely saw the entire edge. As it is, I've got this long grain here in the middle, makes it a little bit easier to cut it out. But you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway because I'm going to chisel this edge and I'll show you the plane on the other face. The plane allows me to skip the sawing of this long grain section. But what I'm going for here is this little wall that will help me ride my saw against it. Good deep marking gauge lines are a real benefit throughout this process because you can get these good strong knife walls as well. While I'm at it, I'm going to flip it over and do the cross grain on the back side. 3CO, get back to me. What am I trying to glue? Maybe I answered that question already about gluing long grain to long grain. Maybe that's what he's asking. So now I'm going to, here's the next thing. You want to be meticulous about this. So what I will do is cut one face here and leave it alone. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the top face and really get that close to my line. And then actually I would do the bottom face in this particular case instance, because obviously gravity pulls down on the bottom. I keep that consistent from side to side. So if I work right to my pencil lines or just leave my pencil line and then leave that face alone and then flip it over and work on the top side. And then as I'm finessing and adjusting the fit, only remove material from the top side here so that I keep one constant. And in the instance here where I want this to sit level in the case, I can come in and I can measure this shoulder and make sure that we're even on both sides here. And if I leave that alone, it's going to set down into those pins level. If I start messing with it, there's every chance that, granted, it's going to be slight, but there's every chance that I can move it slightly out of square. So you do want to add some consistency and you want to figure out, get one face set and don't touch it again. Do all your adjusting on the opposite face so you don't change that orientation in the case itself. So I'm going to start on the bottom face. And I'm going to saw I'm going to move this over so everyone can see it first. And I think I'll actually, since there's a holdfast sitting right here, make my life a little easier. Same technique for that Morton cut, but obviously more precise because I'm working along a knife line. Starting the cut and just slowly dropping the handle, bringing it back along this shoulder. Here's a good example for using a larger saw too, longer saw I should say, because it will really track that line a lot better. Except that I stupidly already started the kerf and these saws are set differently. So rather than futz with that, I'm just going to keep with the same saw. You didn't hear me say this, but sometimes you can have too many saws. You get distracted. Now I'm going to come down here. And I'm sawing down on my pencil line on the edge. This is the tedious part, in case you hadn't figured that out. This is where a dovetail plane can be really nice. You know what? I could also use a rabbet plane here. The problem is that acute angle that's formed by the 12 degrees into the shoulder. And a regular rabbet plane is not going to get you right down into that corner. Rabbeting block plane is the same thing, although those tools can be brought to bear to help speed this process up once you get this shoulder cut. Just trying to clear out that sawdust. You see, once the kerf is good, it just rides in that kerf. That's as deep as I'm going to go. I don't want to go too deep at this point. Okay, yes, Mauricio says, do you have to apply glue when you put it in? Again, it depends on what kind of grain situation you're dealing with. If it is a cross grain situation, you could just leave it dry. I prefer to add glue to the front of the joint. In this case, this is the front. I will glue the chestnut in. So I've got a cross grain situation there, but it's a very narrow 2-inch section. That's not going to cause a problem. I'll leave the rest of the joint dry. So the case side can expand and contract, but it's locked at the front, so the expansion happens towards the back, keeping this line flush with the front of the case. Just when you thought we were done with the sawing fence, we bring it back. It's a multi-purpose tool. I'm taking this 12-degree bevel face, and it's facing up. And what I'm going to do is set this up to the point where it's kind of sort of flush with my board here. A little pressure in. I think I'm actually going to put my planing stop in over here, just give me an extra surface to ride against. What I'm doing is setting this fence so that it's just below the surface of the dust shelf. I may end up altering that later. And you know what? I think I want to add a physical stop behind this, because I'm going to be chiseling. Force of my chisel is going to be running straight into away from me. So this hold fast will do a pretty good job of holding it in place, but I would be better to have something physical to ride against. Enter the Veritas Wonder Dog. Yeah, now I've got a physical barrier to press against. So now my 12-degree angle of this fence acts as a paring block. And because I've severed the fibers, I can work down the face pare this away. I'm going to start close to the shoulder. And work these cross grain sections first. It's actually a lot more difficult with the variety of cross grain and long grain that I've got in this frame, because you can see this long grain doesn't want to just pop out. These long grain fibers are tying it all together. this is an opportunity to come in with a rabbet plane if you wanted and try to remove like the lion's share of this. But again, you won't be able to get into that inside corner just yet. But a shoulder plane would do a pretty decent job here. This guy's being stubborn right here. Here's where bevel down along the grain can be a real lifesaver. There we go. So now with that shoulder exposed, let's see what we can do with a shoulder plane. Switch to a bigger one. A little bit more mass would be helpful here. Just make sure you're tilted up and not cutting into the fence. You can actually get pretty close with the shoulder plane or just a regular rabbet plane. Down here, this is my show face. So I'm going to now use the paring block, aka my sawing fence. And I want to shape this with the chisel. Because as I'm planing across, this is now a situation where I do need to worry about blowout. This is my show face. And if I angle the chisel, oh, I'm sorry, a little off camera. Trying to get in close so you can see what I'm doing here. Instead of just trying to push straight into this, I can angle it, get a little bit easier slicing cut here. And with the chisel pressed firmly on that fence, I'm now matching that tail angle. I'm checking my pencil lines, and I've got just a little bit more to remove to still leave that pencil line. The thing you have to worry about with that shoulder plane is that you might be leaving a less than square wall here. So I'm just going to come back with a chisel. Just square that up a little. Now, this, if I run the chisel along here, I am now in the same geometric plane. So I've matched the 12-degree angle. If I needed to go deeper at this point, I would have to adjust the fence itself. And it'd be a matter of tapping it down a little bit and repeating this process again. But because I'm just touching my pencil line now, I'm going to leave this and I'm going to flip it over, do the other side, and focus on fitting rather than, doing any more pairing here. Because again, I've got two sides of this joint. And if I take too much off on one side, the whole thing may end up a little bit crooked. So because this is the first face I'm working on, and because I've already done the tail over on this other side, this is the exact same process that I chose. You worked so you're just touching your pencil line on that one face, flip it over and do your adjusting the other side. I know I said that already, but I need to reiterate that point because cutting a joint in a demo that just fits in abstract is one thing, but cutting it to fit into a case and resulting in a shelf or a dust frame that is actually square to the case is what we're going for. And that's a very different situation. The good news is now I get to use my dovetail plane and you get to see how much faster this is. Using the shoulder plane was actually a pretty good idea. I've actually never used the shoulder plane. I've used a rabbet plane before, but I like the added mass of that shoulder plane. I know that's a big deal for me to say that because I don't normally like shoulder planes. I don't keep them around very much because they don't have a whole lot of use for me. Nelson, I would not wax this joint in cross grain, only because you're just asking for, well, if you're going to leave it entirely dry, maybe, but if you're going to glue any part of the joint, the wax is going to interfere with the glue. And as you're driving it together, that wax is going to heat up with friction and can spread along the joint. So you may think, oh, I'm just going to wax this back half here. And that glue ends up finding its way through the entire joint and it will really screw, the wax finds its way through the entire joint and it will really screw with your glue. So if you're leaving it entirely dry, maybe. You also may have finishing issues that could come up later on if you're not careful. So the easy answer is, I don't think so. I don't think I would mess with wax on it. Well, that's the thing. If you're finding that in order to fit the joint, you've got to add lubrication, what I would do is come back and do a little bit more pairing of the joint in order to get it to fit well. Another thing to think about is the weather. Say I cut this joint and, frankly, I've got to fit 4 shelves into this case. It's going to take me a little bit of time to get through it. Then I've got a few other things I need to do to the case before I actually glue it up. It's spring right now. The weather is going to change on me. So if I don't glue this case up for 2 weeks, what was a good fit now could be way too tight in 2 weeks. Right now, the humidity is pretty dang high because, as I said at the beginning of this, we're actually in a tornado watch with severe thunderstorms due any second. So the humidity has kind of gone up a fair bit, but it's been very dry in the shop up until now. So my wood is expanding that sounded dirty. My lumber is expanding as I stand here as the moisture goes up. It's not a dramatic thing, but when you have such a precision joint like this dovetail, that tiny little bit of swelling due to a weather change could be enough of a problem to cause you to have a perfect fit case that doesn't fit 2 weeks from now and you've got to go back and pair it again. So this is the dovetail plane. This was actually made by Phil Edwards of Philly Planes in the UK. It's essentially a moving Philister plane. It has a moving fence on the bottom, it's got a depth stop, it's got a skewed iron, but the whole thing is canted over at 12 degrees. So again, remember when I said choose your dovetail angle? This was part of it. And when I contacted Phil about making this, I said I want 12 degrees because 12 degrees is what I was using for my sawing fence and all that fun stuff. You can take a moving Philister, or you could take a good old wooden rabbet plane like this and plane that angle onto the bottom and add a fence to it if you wanted. You could very easily convert, I mean, these rabbet planes are a dime a dozen in antique shops. You could very easily make a sliding dovetail plane. There's actually a pretty good tutorial online. Derek Cohen did one a while back. That would be worth looking up. Here's the other thing about that carpet tape. While I can tap it down with a mallet, this is now loose, and you can see it's still wanting to hang on. So it just adds yet another reason that I use the carpet tape over the sandpaper. Just a little bit of extra loveliness. Get a little closer on this edge so we can see the plane in action. I mean, this dovetail plane is so highly specialized. Let's be real. How much do we really need it in our shops unless you do a lot of sliding dovetails? But man, just watch. Just watch. So I've got the fence set. The fence is set to my knife line here. I've got the depth stop set as well. The key here is the fence is at an angle. So I just press it up. I need to look down and make sure that that fence is flush to the edge. I'm going to get myself in trouble. Although this dovetail plane has a skewed blade and can do cross grain, I don't want to mess this up. There's too much work gone into this. So I'm going to do a little pre-work. And just saw the cross grain. I mean, I sawed a little bit into the long grain as well, but just belt and suspenders situation here. Sever those fibers cleanly so that I don't get a bunch of tearing right at the surface. So you remember all that like difficult sawing I did all the way along the edge? Yeah, that's not necessary here. In my effort to work from the show face back, I'm actually working a little bit against the grain on this maple. Lovely. I mean, that's the nice thing about a skewed blade, right? It kind of lessens that a little bit, but now I have a depth stop on this, but one universal thing about joinery planes is never trust the depth stop. There's so many ways to fool the depth stop. It makes a good suggestion, but a slight change in the body angle, a little bit extra pressure on the back of the cut can cause it to go below your depth stop. Just checking my pencil lines here. Maybe one more pass. And actually the depth stop is now kicking in on me right in the middle. And that's done. As you can see, that was a heck of a lot easier than the chisel approach. But on the converse, Say I were making a sliding dovetail on this piece of poplar and I was going to put it in like this. So my sliding dovetail is just this distance. This is way overkill and it's actually too hard to do because the plane wants to rock on it. Coming with the chisel and using that pairing method I showed before, this can be done in seconds. It's really, there's a time and place for both techniques. Having this plane gets used for case length dovetails like this. This guy's 15 inches long, 24-inch long case. This is where this guy's going to be really beneficial. But you also could see that shoulder plane method I used down on this underside could be done pretty well. And if I ended up staying away from my shoulder a little bit, so that all I had to do was come back and just kind of pare into that inside corner with a chisel, it could be used to speed things up pretty easily there. So at the outset, I talked about how you can compromise a little and do a little bit of tapered dovetail with a consistent pin. So if I were to do a true tapered dovetail, and generally I'll do about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch offset in the pin. And by that, I mean, when I laid out my pins, what I would have done was from the front to the back, this line would have been bumped in a 1/16 of an inch. And I would have cut this line at an angle like that. It's not a matter of degrees, it's about distance of the offset at the back of the case, the distance of that taper. So what I would need to do with the pairing fence is match that taper. So this side and this side would not be the same height. This side would be down maybe a 1/16 of an inch, whatever that offset was. And I would still pair that same shape in. Same exact process we just used here, except now the fence would actually be at an angle to the board to create that slight taper. So it's the same process, it's just there's a little bit more fiddling and matching that angle, and a lot of times what I'll do is on the end grain of the tailboard, I'll run a line that shows that taper. It can be a little fiddly because you're dealing with a narrow face here, but having some sort of pencil line there to work towards can be really beneficial. This is my D shelf, so it's going to go into the bottom. And let's just see how we're fitting. It's actually pretty good. Yeah, as expected. It's going to start to bind right about there because it's not quite fit. Now, if you remember, I went in and I paired the end and the front of the case, try to touch my line a little bit. I may be a little bit proud of that line up here. The idea with a sliding dovetail is to have a fit that you eventually want to tap together. Now, not wallop on the thing. You want to be able to continually tap it and have it advance forward. And it's doing that. But because I know I'm going to end up putting a little bit of glue on this, out on this end, that's going to cause the joint to swell. And what is a hammer tight fit right now may end up freezing on me halfway through, and now I've got glue on the joint and there could be all kinds of problems. Here's the other thing. When you glue these joints, do not put glue in the pin, because all that's going to do is this tail's going to come in and just smush that glue down the pin. Instead of just gluing the front, you've suddenly glued the entire case, and now you have a cross-grain situation that could be really bad. You would put glue on the tail. I would tap the thing together, and then as the tail part came in, it actually squeezes the glue out the end of the joint. But this is advancing, and I'm not having to hit it real hard, but I would rather have something that is almost hand pressure fit at this phase, especially knowing what I know about the weather changing on me and how I know this joint is going to end up swelling on me by the time I end up fitting it in maybe 2 weeks. So here's the next thing. Do not touch the pin. Leave it alone. Don't start adjusting the pin and then adjusting the tail. The pin is a constant. Just as I have said that the bottom is now a constant, I'm only going to adjust the top. And I got to keep this straight. Make sure I'm adjusting the right tail here for the pin that we just cut. So this is the one. So what I'm going to do is mark. No! Do not touch that. Big ol' no. Leave this alone. Don't touch it. What I'm going to be redoing, did I just say that? I did. I'm going to be removing material on this face. And what I'm going to do is just start on the back half. And this is that compromise with a tapered sliding dovetail and a consistent thickness. With the chisel, I'm going to use the plane just because it's faster and we're already pretty long here. With the chisel, it'd be a matter of setting up that fence and paring away a little bit of material and trying to fit it. And if you remove some material and now I'm getting a good fit and it's just starting to bind, but now I've only got 4 inches of the tail to fit, I might actually be able to move ahead with that. Or I can remove a little bit more, starting again at the back, making it a little bit looser at the back so that the joint is driving together with less force. And in the end, the goal I'm going for is something that's going to come up pretty tight right at the front, because a tight joint, assuming all the angles are right, is going to be a gap-free joint. So there's the next thing is use a pencil, mark it out, mark what you're going to remove, because you can very easily start getting very confused on what has to be cleared away and what doesn't. Here again is where the dovetail plane is really nice, because setting up that pairing fence, I mean, obviously I wouldn't have taken it down like I did if I knew that I was going to still be using it. But just being able to make a pass like that, come on, too much crap on the bench right now. There we go. You can see I didn't do much. I barely made like 1.5 passes there. Okay, now hand pressure. See that? I'm not having to tap it. Still a little too tight. Again, I would love to be able to just use hand pressure to seat it to maybe 2 inches from fully seated. Now to do this, I'm actually going to have to change my depth stop, which is kind of an issue in the grand construction scheme of things. Because I still, in the building of this case, still have 1, 2, 2.5 pins to cut. And therefore all of the tails, I've cut 2 tails on this. I've got all that stuff to still do. I probably would not want to adjust my depth stop because I've got this depth stop set that it kind of bottoms out. Even though I said I don't trust depth stops, it does kind of bottom out knowing that the joint is still going to be a little too fat. If I adjust it now, I really have to adjust it back when I start over and do the rest of my frames. So I would get this fit to this point, and then I would move on to the other tails and get everything to this point so that the little adjustment I make to this depth stop, I'm not having to reset later, and I could do all the frames at once. Every time I change this setting, there's every chance it's not going to be consistent unless you've got some sort of gauge or jig or something like that. It's not impossible, certainly. I'm going to do it now, but as a best practice, I would want to leave this, do all of my joints, and then adjust it. So in this case, I'm just going to move it well out of the way. Ooh, thunder. Thunder. I better wrap this up because knowing my neighborhood, the power's going to go out. Hey, by the way, thanks everybody for coming and hanging out with me on Good Friday. I wish I had every Friday off. It'd be awesome. You know, I haven't checked if there are any questions. Here you go, Garth. Here's the bottom of the plane. It's a moving Philister plane, buddy. It is a moving Philister plane with a 12-degree angle cut, 12-degree angle cut on the sole and a 12-degree angle cut on the fence itself. It's exactly the same as a moving Philister plane. The skew angle of the blade is all the same construction, everything. It's super simple. That's why I say you can take a regular old rabbet plane, just cut a 12-degree angle on the bottom. And even if you didn't have the fence and you were just working against that knife line, be the same way as you cut a rabbet on a knife line. But now you've got the 12-degree angle, so you can get into that acute inside corner. Hi, Garth, by the way. I haven't heard from you in a while. If Time Warp Toolworks wants to start making sliding dovetail planes, I'm all over that. All right, what was that? 3 shavings? And you can see, obviously, if I were not trying to fit stuff in camera, I would have, you know, the case side set up somewhere else instead of having to move all this crap around every time I try to fit it. All right, good, 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 good. Coming up tight, right there. So you can see what we're doing here. We're getting there. The stupidest thing you can do right now is rush it and start thinking, you know, I took 3 passes there and I could have said, I could take 4 or 5 more passes, and then the whole joint is loose and you blew it. You've got to be really slow and meticulous here. This joint is probably the most precise joint you're going to cut, except with the exception of maybe some of the crazy Japanese joinery. This one, it's a beast. Now, you saw how easily that fit at the first part. So, and you know what? I didn't label it like I said I should. Okay, just wanted to double check. Remember I wrote no on the bottom here? You see why that's so important? So I know I'm working on the right face, but I wanted to make sure I hadn't transposed from side to side. So you need to constantly be marking. Things were pretty good till about the halfway point. So there's no reason, let me switch angles here. There's no reason for me to come back and take another plane pass on the back side. That's just going to make that even looser. Now you're taking this tapered tail compromise too far, and this is going to be loose. This was really good hand tight fit until about the halfway point. So it makes no sense to remove more material at the back half. I'm just going to focus on the front. I'm going to take 2 passes, and I'm actually going to leave those pencil marks right at the front because I don't want that to be too loose. Let me take 1 more pass. This may be it. Good, good. And again, you can see it's sliding through, but as I move this, you know, there's a little bit of wiggle room there, but it's so little. Okay, that I think is what we want. You see how I'm not really walloping on this, but every time I hit it, there's noticeable movement here. If it starts to get too tight, you will hear the pitch change. It will go up as I'm tapping. I'm also putting pressure down, keeping the joint, the wedging action of the joint, from wanting to ride up and out. Slow and steady. Love it when a plan comes together. Sliding dovetail joint. Whoo-wee. That's nice. That's nice. And the beauty of this, I mean, this sucker is rock steady. And with a case, especially this particular, this is what I would call a lingerie chest, tall and skinny. This case is going to be so prone to racking, this long, skinny case. These dovetails are going to suck it in and hold that whole thing from bowing out. That mechanical advantage of that joint will hold the whole thing together and keep it super, super rigid, because I've got 4 of these all on the way. So there'll be no racking from side to side. There'll be no bowing of the case. What that translates to as a case is the interior boxes for the drawers will be square, and they will stay square for the next 900 years, so that you won't have issues with the drawers binding as movement happens over time. You now have a control surface with which to fit the drawer to. And the tiny bit of taper, if I look back here, I've got just a little bit of wiggle room. But it certainly does not compromise the efficacy of the joint, the strength of the joint at all. That's going to be left dry. I'm going to glue just the front, probably just the chestnut is what I'll end up gluing in here, and leave the maple secondary stuff completely dry throughout. And that tiny little bit of taper, and being aware that I'm only removing from one face. Again, because this face has remained constant and there is no taper, and it's even calling it a taper is a bit too much, right? I mean, there's maybe 0.03 of an inch thinner at the back half than it is at the front half. But this lower face is consistent and square all the way across. So as gravity and the weight of drawers presses down on this case, this registers in line with the case. So it will always be square. And that's the important part to remember. Set that bottom line and do not touch it, so that you maintain that squareness of the case and the level from side to side. The adjustments and the slight taper you're adding is all on the top of the joint. We good? Any questions? I've gone I knew this was not going to be an hour-long presentation. There's nothing simple about sliding dovetails. But before I close this thing off, are there any questions about all this? And Garth, if you're still here, I think you should make sliding dovetail planes. So does everyone in the chat room. Brian says, any reason why you fit the frame show face to back instead of back to front? I'm not sure I follow that question. Any reason why you fit the frame show face to back instead of back to front? Well, if I'm understanding what you're saying, instead of driving it in from the back to the front, because I am imparting that little bit of taper, and I really want this show face to wedge up super tight, if I were to go from back to front, I'm driving the thickest part of this board all the way through the case. And even if it was an exact piston fit, wood compresses. The Janka hardness on this stuff on chestnut is much lighter than oak. So continually driving that through from back to front is going to compress and deform that. So the fewer amount of times that I can put pressure on this show face, the better. Right now, that angle is bad, but that is a gap-free joint. There's a little bit of pencil lead showing. That dark line there is pencil lead. There's dark line on the bottom is pencil lead, but that is a totally gap-free joint. When I apply glue to that, it's going to be even more gap-free because it's going to swell up. But if I continually fit that several times and ran that through several times, it would get looser every single time. So I would always want to fit from front to back. Moreover, there's always a chance that those sharp irises on the edge of that dovetail could splinter or wear over or something, especially in a ring porous wood like chestnut. You want to try to leave that alone as much as possible. Oh, Garth, is it square? I'm sure it is. How dare you, sir? Of course it's square. God, I really hope it's square. Oh, hell yeah. Yep, it's square. But here's the thing. In case anybody doesn't believe me. Can we see that? It's square. It's square. But watch this. I can bend that over so that it's not square. There's some flex. There will always be a little bit of flex. So say it was out of square, and just be a matter of flexing it back. The real test of whether or not it will be square is when it is fit into both sides of the case. And a while ago I said that when I do this, I like to actually try to fit both tails at the same time, because that gives me that feeling of, is it square from side to side? That really comes down to the pins and getting the spacing of the pins exactly equal. And because I used dividers to lay out the pins, I got the exact spacing all the way along the case. If you really wanted to, you could lay out one side of the case, gang the boards together, and square your lines across both cases. This is going to be a 30-inch span. I could use my drywall square for that, but that would be the best way to ensure that they're all equal. As long as they're equal and at the same vertical distance from one another, squareness should almost be a non-issue. I mean, if you fit this thing super out of square, there's really not that much material to remove. You'd have to be like really not paying attention to get it out of square. And if it were, it would be maybe a degree or two, which would flex. And assuming the pins are placed identically on left and right sides of the case, when you fit it, it's going to pull itself into square. So that's the other thing. But yes, it's square. Dovetails are self-squaring joints. Haven't you heard that? Of course they are. Is router plane the easiest tool to do the job? I think so. That's what the router plane was designed to do. Level the floor of housed joints. It does it better than anything else. The only other tool that I would use in there, you know, it would be have something that would fit in there. You could fit a narrow rabbet plane in there. I mean, it would have to be a very narrow rabbet plane to get in there, or a narrow shoulder plane. But what you can't be certain of is, am I creating, while I may be creating a flat floor, is the floor parallel to the inside surface of the case? And the router plane rides off the inside surface of the case with the cutter hanging below. So what it does, what it is designed to do, is level the floor of a housed joint in reference to the case side. So you get consistent depth dados. This is ideal, the ideal tool for housed joinery, which is what dados, grooves, and sliding dovetails all are. So most definitely. There are other tools you could use, but that one, that's it. Chestnut smells very much like oak, but sweeter. It's not quite as tannin rich as red oak. So it doesn't have that bite to it, but it's got a similar smell. It's just kind of a mellower smell to it. Or one might say less smell than oak. Definitely more than white oak, though. Oh, side rabbet planes. Yeah, no, not a fan. Not a fan. I had a pair of vintage ones. I even tried Veritas's side rabbet plane. And the whole idea is you can, turn them over on the side and cut it. But it's designed to cut the wall of the pin, the female part of the joint. Why would I bother if I can saw it to the correct angle? Skip the whole thing. The saw, in my opinion, is the best tool for the job there, because it's going to cut across the grain. You've got a nice long plate. Assuming your saw is not bent, it's going to cut a straight line. Using the fence as reference, it's going to cut a straight line. As I said at the beginning, cutting the pin was the easy part of this. That's stupid easy. The hardest part is setting the fence in place and just running it against it, making sure you don't saw past your line. Those side rabbet planes, and even if it's not a dovetail, even if it's a dado, why would I adjust the width of a dado when I can just plane the thickness of the shelf? Where you get into trouble is if you're planing different sides of the shelf and you're throwing the shelf akimbo, which is again why you leave a control surface. You leave the bottom as it is and only adjust off the top. Side rabbet planes have absolutely no use whatsoever, I think, ever in any wood shop, ever. I'm not at all opinionated. Would I do a follow-up video on getting a perfect fit on the shoulder-to-shoulder distances for case length sliding dovetails? Yeah, I probably have something actually. That was just shooting. Where's my mallet? The important thing with fitting, with casework in general, is eliminating variables as much as possible. I kind of want to take this out of here before the thunderstorm comes in and it swells and it freezes in place. It's a lot easier going the other way when there's a fence to back it up. And now it comes loose. So, what I mean by eliminating variables to create square cases is one step at a time. First, you need to start with the outer dimensions of the case. You need to make sure that you get all of the parts of the case to be identically sized. Well, what I'll do is size one part, lay it on top of the other part, trace the shape, and plane to my lines. It's all about working to my lines. Then I will come to the shooting board, shoot one edge on my master board, if you will. Now I will measure out or use dividers or whatever to get the final length of my board. I'll saw and shoot it to final length. And again, trace that length onto its partner, the opposite side. Saw and shoot down to my line. So now I have two boards that are of identical length and identical width. That's the first part. You're never going to case that's going to line up or be square or have shoulder to shoulder line up or anything if these two boards are different sizes. Then, in cutting the bottom board, you pretty much do the same thing. If you got a bottom and a top board, in this case I have a bottom board and two top rails. I don't have a solid, I do have a solid top, but it will actually go on the rails. The length of the top rails is identical to the length of the bottom board. So the same thing. Once I created this board, I used the width of the side panels to lay out the width of the bottom board. Again, trace that plane to my line. I got a straight reference edge with the shooting board, got another, measured out my length, sawed it, got it shot to final length. I used this dimension to lay out the length of my rails. The width of the rails is irrelevant. I think they're actually the same, which was an extra step I didn't need to do because these are just, really all these are is attachment points for the top. But the length must be the same as the bottom board because then your case will bow out or bow in because you've got a separate length. Then it came down to doing dovetails. And that's a matter of, using the same gauge settings to set the shoulders. In this case, I've shot the ends, so the ends are now reference surfaces. So I can take my marking gauge, set that shoulder dimension, and mark both shoulders at the same time. Instead of trusting that the end grain on this board is exactly the same and running the gauge around it, this is my master board. I've set the shoulders on this. I will set this board in front of it, gang the boards together, in other words, putting it up against a fence, use a square, drop a knife in the knife line on the master board, and run it all the way across. with the boards lined up, I now have set that shoulder dimension because it's shoulder to shoulder dimension that's important. Whatever this dimension is on this board has now been transferred over to this board because I just lined it up. In fact, what I generally will do is set the shoulders before I true up the ends. Because otherwise, you could true up the ends and then you've got to make sure that those ends are perfectly flush. Instead, what I'll do here. Piece of poplar I threw on the floor. Obviously it's, rough surface, but if I were to gang these boards together, take this shoulder line and this shoulder line, with them ganged together, square that across, the dimension from shoulder to shoulder on this board is exactly the same as this board. This board is a little bit longer. It'd be a matter of trimming that down later. But if you're talking about tenons, tenon length is irrelevant. You can saw that later after you've cut the tenon. But ganging them together ensures that this reference surface from knife line to knife line is same from board to board. That ensures that my case will be square when I assemble it. The same thing happened with these frames. I have 4 of them. 16 parts all had to be put together. And you can see here again, the joinery overlaps. I've got bridles at the back and I've got a mortise and tenon in the back. I leave the front piece long because I don't want to blow out the mortise as I'm chopping it. This length, no idea what this length is. Totally doesn't matter. But the shoulder to shoulder dimensions, or in this case, mortise to mortise, matters. Shoulder to shoulder of bridle to bridle, and shoulder from tenon to tenon absolutely matters. So every single one of these boards, there are 4 dust shelves, 2 per. That's 8 of these boards with a tenon on each end. I marked out the knife line and then I ganged all 8 of them together and ran that knife line across square and sawed all of my tenons to that same line. That ensured that each one of these styles was exactly the same dimension from shoulder to shoulder. I purposely designed this dimension from side to side to be a tiny bit wider than what I knew I would need for the dovetails. But I cut the dovetail pins first so that I could specifically grab the floor of one pin to the floor of the next pin, that dimension, and size this to that. So this board, I don't think has been sized. I flushed up the joinery. This one's the one we just finished. I ran this on the shooting board and got a reference edge. And then with the case assembled, I drop the corner in the bottom of the pin and line it up with the bottom of the pin on the other side of the case. With the case assembled, that dimension is fixed. I've eliminated that variable and I just put a little pencil mark to say I was close to that. That's where I need to be. Went over to the shooting board and shot to the point where I left my pencil line, came back to the case and tried to fit it. Now it was still a little too thick. Took one pass, only one pass, one ping only, please. Only one pass on the shooting board, came back to the case and tried to fit it. I was looking for a friction fit from bottom of pin to bottom of pin. I think I ended up making 3 passes till I finally got there. It's the exact same thing we're talking about with fitting this shelf. I made like a pass with a dovetail plane, tried to fit it, made another pass, tried to fit it. Take your time, be meticulous. It's the exact same process with getting this shoulder to shoulder dimension right. Shooting board is your friend in that case because I can remove 1/1000th of an inch at a time. So no, I won't consider doing another video. I just did it now. All right. Did I cover why 2/3 depth instead of the normal 1/3 or 1/2? Sean, why are you asking weird questions? No, I didn't, but I'm not sure I follow your question. Why 2/3 depth instead of the normal 1/3 or 1.5? Did I do 2/3? No, it's about half. If you're talking about the depth of the pen, it's about half. But I say about because I didn't plan on it being a specific dimension. What I did was figure out my dimension based upon the geometry of the tail. Knowing that I'm starting with a 5/8 inch thick dust frame. And knowing that I really don't like the neck of the tail to be thinner than 3/8 of an inch. Unless you're dealing with really, really thin stock. But for most furniture size parts, 3/8 of an inch, the thin part of that neck, is strong enough. Getting too much narrower than that, to me, it feels brittle. So 3/8 ends up being my limiting factor in here. Adding a 12-degree angle from 3/8 to 3/8 gives me something that needs to fit within a 5/8 inch thickness. I did say this at the beginning, starting with 3/8 inch neck and using 12-degree angle will fit inside a 3/4 inch thickness board. I think the final dimension from here to here, I can tell you, it is about a 32nd shy of 3/4. Obviously, if it were proud of 3/4, you can't do that with a 3/4 board. You need your original stock thickness to be heavier than 3/4. It has to fit in there. So then, starting with that dimension, running that 12-degree angle out, I just kind of went with something that was going to give me a good pleasing shape rather than saying, I didn't, in other words, start with the depth of the pen. That really wasn't, it was a resultant factor rather than a controlling factor in that particular equation. And I don't think there's any such thing as normal when it comes to normal half or normal 1/3, unless maybe you're talking about tenons. All right, I'm sure I've missed some questions here, but I probably need to close this off. We're coming up on 2 hours. So if I missed your question, I apologize. I will do my best to not be so long in between these sessions. I really have fun doing these sessions. I certainly get great feedback from you guys that obviously you must enjoy it. So I will try to do another one in the not so distant future. It's all just a matter of hours in the day, my friends. So thank you for coming out. It's always cool. It's great to hang out with everybody. So with that, I will say goodbye.